Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I do appreciate you being with me. Hope your week is going absolutely fantastic. Now, most of you know by now, I think, that I do most of my filming Monday through Wednesday on Sunday morning, sometimes on Saturday, in preparation, what have you. But nonetheless, in spite of that, hope your week is going really, really well. All right. For Monday and Tuesday, we connected the dots between Daniel chapter 12 and Revelation chapter 20. Now, let me say again, folks, unless you can prove definitively that the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is a different resurrection from that posited in Revelation chapter 20, then since the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12 would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, verse 7, that means that the resurrection of Revelation chapter 20 would be fulfilled at the same identical time. Okay, who is Daniel's holy people? It's Old Covenant Israel. What was her power? It was the Old Covenant, her covenant relationship with Yahweh. When was that covenant relationship terminated? Scattered in AD 70. It wasn't at the cross. And if you try to say it was at the cross, then you have the resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, being fulfilled at that time. Because the text is very emphatic. Okay, so let me reiterate that point. Unless you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is a different resurrection from that in Revelation chapter 20, then this means that the resurrection of Revelation chapter 20 was fulfilled when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. Now then, I mentioned yesterday we're not going to deal a whole lot with Matthew chapter 21, 25, 31 and following, because it doesn't contain some of the explicit statements that these other texts do. But here's my premise. For instance, Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia, the erchomai, of the coming of the Son of Man, when he shall sit on the throne of his glory, okay, is the time of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now look, I know and I understand there's some out there who say, well, no, this is totally different, Preston, because Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is when Christ comes to sit on his throne, but 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is when Christ surrenders the kingdom to the Father. Well, first of all, that is a misunderstanding of what 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about. And 1 Corinthians 15 says, he must continue to reign until all things are put under his feet. He would continue to reign, quote, until the end. We'll be talking about that. Then shall he deliver the kingdom to the Father. And so we're told, well, look, it says he's going to deliver the kingdom to the Father. That's not him sitting on the throne of his glory. So you have two different times, two different events. Well, if we do not understand Hebraic thought and expressions, then we might think that. And if we do not understand the linguistics of 1 Corinthians 15, 23 and following, we might think that. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when it says, then shall he deliver the kingdom to the Father, that word deliver is from the Greek word paradidomai, if I pronounce that correctly. And paradidomai doesn't mean surrender or abdicate or give it up. For instance, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which you have received, which I delivered unto you, which you believed, which you accepted, wherein also you are saved, if you keep in mind that which I delivered to you. Paradidomai. Now let me ask you a question. when Paul delivered the gospel to the Corinthians, did he surrender it? Did he surrender authority over it? Did he stop having the gospel? Well, we know he preached it in other places after that. So yeah, he still possessed the gospel. He was still an apostle with apostolic authority of the gospel. So yeah, he did not surrender at paradidomai. He didn't surrender the gospel. And neither was Jesus to surrender the kingdom at his parousia. This word paradidomai carries with it a whole lot of the idea of sharing. Now watch this. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 3. Now this is at the time of the millennium. After the millennium, excuse me. When Christ's enemies have been put under him. You know, Satan and his angels cast in the lake of fire. At that time of victory, the Father and the Son sit on the throne. Does that sound like Jesus abdicated the kingdom to you? Or does it sound like they're sharing the kingdom? So that's a misunderstanding. Now, there are other things that we could go into. I mentioned understanding Hebraic thought and expression. We have examples in the Old Testament of men who are already kings, already ruling, and yet it spoke of a given certain day, and it says, then they sat on their throne. Were they not sitting on the throne before that? Well, sitting on the throne doesn't mean to literally, physically sit on a throne. And in other words, that's not the totality of its meaning. Is it included? Well, sure, I'm not denying that. But what it meant was, here is a special occasion in the totality of their rule and in the totality of their reign. On a special occasion, they took the throne and they exercised the same authority, the same sovereignty that they already possessed, that they had already been exercising on other occasions. But this is a separate occasion. This is a different occasion. It's special. And it certainly doesn't mean that they abdicated. They were exercising their kingly authority, which they already possessed, which they had already exercised prior to this particular day of sitting on the throne. If anybody wants, I can go into that later, but no need to at this point. So here's the point. Matthew chapter 25 is indeed the same time as Revelation chapter 20. It is indeed the time of Revelation chapter 11. Matthew chapter 25 is the time of the resurrection. I have to admit, I had lived several years before I ever heard anybody suggest, as dispensationalists do, that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is different from Revelation chapter 20. Well, this gets to the fact, as I've already shared with you, dispensationalists have 5 separate resurrections. And it's incredibly convoluted as far as I'm concerned, and I mean no disrespect, but there is no united narrative in the dispensational world. Now then, what I want to focus on, having looked at Matthew 25 ever so briefly here, to demonstrate the unity between Matthew 25 and 30 and Revelation chapter 20, I want to move on, and I'll incorporate Matthew 25 into what I'm about to discuss here later. But 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the pivotal, the foundational, Paul's most extensive discussion of the resurrection. What does Paul say? Now, I'm going to read, interestingly enough, from N.T. Wright's translation. I just randomly picked this up this morning, by the way. into my studio, as I came into my studio, I thought, well, I'll see what N.T. Wright has to say about the passages that we want to look at. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 23. As he's talking about the resurrection, in verse 22, as in Adam all men die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Verse 23, each, however, in proper order. Now, that's translating the Greek word tagma. The Greek word tagma means order. Orderly arrangement has nothing to do with nature or form. It is chronological order. Okay? That's very important. Each, however, in proper order. The Messiah rises as the first fruits. Then those who belong to the Messiah will arise at the time of his royal arrival. Well, royal arrival is being translated from parousia, or parousia, if you please. Then comes the end. Notice how N.T. Wright then says, the goal. The goal. When he hands over the kingly rule to God the Father. Now, I don't particularly care for that because it seems to convey the idea of surrendering. And N.T. Wright doesn't really believe that Jesus no longer rules after the parousia. He doesn't believe in that. So to me, this is somewhat of an unfortunate translation. But anyway, then comes the end when he hands over the kingly rule to God the Father. When he has destroyed all rule and all authority and power, he has to go on ruling, you see. And this is a translation of the present infinitives in the Greek, which recognizes that at the time Paul is writing, Jesus was even then ruling and reigning on the throne. Okay? So he must go on ruling, you see, until he has put all enemies under his feet. Death is the last enemy to be destroyed because he has put all enemies under his feet. But when it says that everything is put in order under him, it's obvious that this doesn't include the one who put everything in order under him. No, when everything is put in order under him, then the Son himself will be placed in proper order under the one who placed everything in order under him, so that God may be all in all. Now, there's an awful lot to unpack here, but let me express this as simply as I can. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. The parousia of Christ is at the resurrection, the time of the rewarding, right? Everlasting life, time of rewarding. So the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the time of the resurrection to eternal life. And again, that's at Christ's parousia, when he puts down his enemies. Got that? Revelation chapter 20 is the resurrection when he puts down his enemy, the last enemy, i.e., Satan and death. Okay, so since 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the resurrection, at the parousia of Christ to destroy the last enemy, then it must be the resurrection of Revelation chapter 20, the great judgment scene, the great white throne scene, at which Satan and death are destroyed. You know, the last enemy. Therefore, Revelation chapter 20 is the same resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, at his parousia to put the last enemy down. When would that be? Well, again, 1 Corinthians 15 has it at the parousia. Revelation chapter 20 has it at the great white throne judgment. Well, wait a minute. Isn't Matthew chapter 25, 31 talking about the parousia of Christ? Sure it is. Well, if Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is talking about the parousia of Christ, his erchomai, parousia is the noun, erchomai is the verb. So if Matthew chapter 25 is the coming of the Lord for the rewarding of the nations. And if Revelation chapter 20 is the time of the coming of Christ, the parousia, his erchomai and parousia, for the rewarding of the dead, then Matthew chapter 25 is the same as Revelation chapter 20. Okay, when would this be fulfilled? 1 Corinthians 15. The time of the end. The end of what? Is it the end of time, as I was taught when I was a young man? Is it the end of the Christian age, as I was taught? As futurists still believe? Well, it's the end of something. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55, and 56. The end is the end of the law, which was the strength of sin. Ask yourself the question. What law was the strength of sin? What law gave sin its strength and power and made it, exceedingly sinful? Well, Paul said in Romans chapter 7, that was the old covenant. It was Torah. It was the law of Moses. I had not known sin except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. I was alive once without the law. The commandment came. What commandment? Thou shalt not covet. The commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And Paul said the law entered to make sin exceedingly sinful. That's the power or the strength of sin. So the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the time when the last enemy would be put down, is when the old law, the law of Moses, would be taken out of the way. Revelation chapter 20 is the time of when the last enemy would be taken out of the way, meaning it's the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. But the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, and thus Revelation chapter 20, would be when the law, that was the strength of sin, was taken out of the way. And that was in AD 70. Wasn't at the cross. The law was not nailed to the cross, as I was raised believing. 1 Corinthians 15, Revelation chapter 20. Same resurrection at the parousia of Christ to take away the law that was the strength of sin and overcome the sin and the death. And that was in AD 70. Hey, don't forget my fantastic, August 2023 two-book special. Go to my website. Look at the banner right up at the very top. Order these two books. Save yourselves $12. Okay? Since we're talking about resurrection, you need both of these books. Okay. Thanks for joining me. We will continue this week. Okay? Friday, my examination of Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism? And Mike Sullivan and I, if I don't have anything else happen like it did this last time, we'll continue our examination of Doug Wilson's critique of full preterism. Okay? Thanks for joining me. I'll see you later this week.